One of the myths that we wanted to bust in this exhibition was the idea that Americans didn't have information about the threat of Nazism as in the 1930s and 1940s. Later on in the exhibition, you'll even see that Americans had a good deal of information about the murder of Jews as it was happening. Early on, Americans are very interested in the rise of this new world leader, Adolf Hitler. And so what we show here is a number of magazines from 1932, 1933, 34, at the beginning of the Nazi regime, where you see Hitler on the cover of Vanity Fair and Time and Newsweek. This one is particularly fascinating. That's Joseph Goebbels on the cover of Time magazine, July 10th, 1933. And there's a 3,000-word article in this magazine covering Nazi Germany. And what you see even on the cover, under the words Minister of Propaganda Goebbels, is, "Say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame." So Americans who were picking up magazines like this, and these are popular magazines, could have read about the rise of fascism in Germany, but what's not hidden here is the fact that anti-Semitism is essential to Nazi ideology. This doesn't mean that Americans could have predicted in 1933 that mass murder is to come by the 1940s, but it doesn't allow us to say, oh, we didn't know. We can't let Americans of the 1930s off the hook that easily. One of the most interesting projects the museum launched years before the exhibition, fully 2.5 years before the exhibition opened, is called History Unfolded. And it's a crowdsourced website where we asked students and history buffs throughout the country to go into their local newspapers, their non-digitized newspapers, in their local historical societies and libraries and archives, and look for coverage of Nazism. And what we found is that Americans across the country could have had access to a lot of information about the threat of Nazism. Citizen historians around the country have uploaded more than 15,000 articles to our website, and we put a number of them here on this interactive map so visitors can touch on any state and see, for example, here's an article from Indianapolis, the Indianapolis Star, in September of 1935, and front page news there is coverage of the Nuremberg Laws, defiant Nazis, past decrees against Jews. I'll show you just one more from Nevada that speaks to an interesting challenge that we thought about as we were putting together this exhibition. This is a Reno, Nevada paper, Nevada State Journal, March 27th of 33. And they're reporting on the fact that Albert Einstein is renouncing his citizenship. And that he won't return to Germany. But if you look over 2 columns, also you see this article, Mistreatment of Jews Ends. There had been no stories about persecution of Jews for a week coming out of Nazi Germany. And Secretary of State Hull says that we may consider physical mistreatment of Jews virtually terminated. And that speaks to one of the central challenges of this exhibition, is to get visitors to read history forward. We know the end of the story. We know that Nazism would ultimately lead to mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. But Americans in the 1930s had no idea that was coming. And so that's one of the challenges that we tried to address throughout the exhibition, is to get people to read history as it was happening. And that's one of the reasons you see such a chronological treatment in this exhibition. Early on, some communities took to the streets against Nazism, and you see here rallies in 1933 across the United States condemning the Nazi regime. You'll see marches by Jewish communities, by labor organizations in Philadelphia, in Cleveland, in New York, in Chicago, in Boston. There are rallies, there are protests, there are movements to boycott German-made goods, and you see a lot of ephemera in this case of some of the boycott material, stamps that you would affix to letters to show that you supported boycotting German-made goods or fighting communism, fascism, and Nazism, buttons showing your support of a cause for boycotting Nazi Germany, or even matchbooks saying, "For humanity's sake, don't buy German goods." There are anti-Nazi actions right away in the spring of 1933, many led by this man, Rabbi Stephen Wise. This is a mass rally at Madison Square Garden in March of 1933. You see individual actions, you see rallies, you see protests. You don't see a sustained anti-Nazi movement that takes hold in the United States. One of the ways we wanted to get at the question of what was on all Americans' minds, or one of the ways we decided to get at the question of what's on all Americans' minds, was to use public opinion polling throughout the exhibition. Gallup and other organizations are actively polling Americans by the mid-1930s. And we use polls like this throughout the exhibition to show Americans' concerns at home. Later on, you'll see many polls that ask Americans' opinion about whether we should be letting in refugees. By the end of the exhibition, Gallup is polling in 1942, 1943, 1944, asking Americans whether they believe the stories of the atrocities coming out of Nazi Germany and out of Europe. So here, early on, what's on Americans' minds in November of 1936 is deep concern about our own economy. The depths of the Depression are on all Americans' minds at this point. You'll see over here a poll that speaks to American isolationism. Americans are asked whether they think it was a mistake for the United States to enter World War I, and you see 70% of Americans say yes. So this was one of the ways we tried to get at the extent of our economic fears, or Americans' economic fears, and their isolationism. There are in the depths of this depression, where 25% of Americans are out of work, so much of what's going on in the United States in the mid-1930s is about economic recovery, and I think that prevents Americans from looking abroad as much as they might have. FDR's first term, 1933 to 1937, is so much about trying to lift the country out of the Depression through the New Deal, and foreign policy concerns are not the priority at that point. We also try to round out the media landscape by showing American newsreels here. Even during the Depression, Americans went to the movies. Movies were relatively cheap. You could sit there all day, and before the movies, you'd watch digests of the news of the week. What we're showing in some of these newsreels is the extent of American isolationism in world conflicts in the 1930s. Americans stay out of the Spanish Civil War. They stay out of conflicts with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. They stay out of China and the war between China and Japan. And we're seeing here in some of these newsreels the extent of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States as well.
Our unemployment problem was transferred to the United States from foreign lands. And if we had refused admission to the 16,500,000 foreign-born in our midst, there would be no serious unemployment problem to harass us.
The 1930s in the United States are arguably the height of anti-Semitism here in the 20th century. Some historians estimate that there's 100 new anti-Semitic organizations founded in the United States in the 1930s. And one of the people who gives voice to this more than anyone else is Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest out of Detroit. And you see him in a very popular way ranting against Jewish communism, questioning the American loyalty of Jews and others. And you see that in some of the newsreel footage that we show in the exhibition.
New York turns out 18,000 strong for a glimpse of Detroit's famous radio orator, Father Charles E. Coughlin.
I ask you in the name of Christianity, which abhors communism, in the name of patriotism, which loved America to carry it on to victory, I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.